Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we are going over the TCG best decks post YCS Indianapolis, post Agov, post all of that stuff. Yeah, there's a few things to talk about. Most notably, the actual list that I have here. As you can see, we have Tier 1, Tier 1.5, and Tier 1.75, and then Rogue and everything else. And the reason for this, very simply, is that genuinely, there isn't a whole lot that isn't good right now. The format is incredibly diverse and has a lot of options available to you, and while yes, Rescue Ace did do very well post-Indianapolis, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that it's the best deck or that it has the best matchups. I think it was just a good meta call for that specific event, and yes, it did do very well, but I do think that it loses to a lot, and with how diverse the format is, if it sees those matchups, it's pretty bad, but if it doesn't, I do think that it is in the best spot. So immediately we're going to start with that. Obviously, it's in Tier 1. I don't think it's the sole best deck, but I do think that it is in the best spot, which is why I'm probably going to leave it as the only Tier 1. But even with that being said, I don't think it's like meta-defining. I think that there are a lot of decks that can beat this, and we'll go over them here. Next up, we have Branded. Branded is, more specifically, I should say, this is Chimera, not Branded, because we do have Branded here. But they're basically two decks of the same ideas. But it's a good deck. Don't get me wrong, I think that Branded Chimera is still very, very strong and has the ability to play through quite a bit. Not a whole lot. I think most decks are basically able to put up the interactions that really do cook this deck. But more specifically, I think that it also is able to add a lot of recursion, as well as just kind of like make the same end boards over and over, and just kind of push through quite a lot. I think it's one of the matchups that most decks do need to be aware of, and you have to be cognizant of this deck and how it functions, and is not necessarily something that can just be thrown to the wayside and forgotten about. Next up, Branded. Branded loses to Hand Traps, which I think a lot of people are playing, but more specifically, I think that it just doesn't do enough without the Chimera stuff. Yes, it does have a lot of recursion that it does have available to it, but it's honestly not nearly as good as just like the regular Branded stuff, or not Branded stuff, the regular Chimera stuff. I think the illusions do really add a lot of oomph to that deck, so I'm going to put it in Rogue for now. Dinos, I don't know. Dinos, I'm gonna put them in everything else for right now. I just don't see them really doing a whole lot. But who knows? Honestly, this is one of the lists that I have felt the least comfortable with because of how many different ideas people have brought to the table with like YCS Indianapolis and just throughout that have done really well in theory, or like have done really poorly in theory, but then executed the opposite in actual practice. So honestly, I don't know. Maybe Dinos are actually really good and like a sleeper deck to, actually compete in the metagame, but with one miscellaneous source, I don't really see it doing a whole lot. Next up, we have Dragon Link. Dragon Link, losing a Chaos Space and a Magnemut really does matter. But even with that being said, I still feel like the deck ends on very similar boards. It had one Magnemut and one Bestial Lubellion at Worlds, and then still ended up winning Worlds. But I do think that format was honestly weaker. However, even with that being said, I still think that this deck is very strong. I still think that there's a lot that it can do. Going first, sending up a Boral End. Sometimes your opponent's just not going to be able to out that. I don't think everyone is playing an out to that. And in games 2 and 3, I feel like there are a lot of options for you to be able to side in options for you. So more generic, like Hand Traps and stuff like that in the side deck does allow the Dragon Link deck to kind of do pretty well. Also, because of some of the other decks, most notably Unchained and Tearlaments, giving you access to at least somewhat advantage with your Bestials, I do think that boosts this strategy a little bit more than in the past. Next up, Live Twins. There is a Sprite over here. We'll talk about Sprite and its variants with that, but honestly, Live Twins I don't really see doing all that much, so I'm going to put them in everything else. Yes, you could say that this is like a Live Twin Sprite variant, but again, I just want to talk about Sprite, because most Sprite variants, I feel like, function very similarly, and I do think that Sprite overall as a deck, we're going to talk about that later. I don't think it's great, but we'll talk about it. Next up, we have Exosister. Exosister I don't see doing all that well. In the current format, I think, yes. I think there was like one Exosister player who got top 8 at the YCS Indianapolis, which is wild. But I do think that Exosister has the ability to just kind of like high roll events and just like end up basically getting a whole bunch of really decent matchups and just doing really well. I also think that sometimes you just draw really good hands and end up taking it. Now, that's not to discount the play from the actual Exosister player. I'm not saying that they played poorly or that their deck building decisions weren't great, but I do think that this is definitely one of the decks that's not likely to see competition continually. I don't think it's going to continually top. I think that was just one of those things where it's like, yeah, they ended up getting a good roll, and they ended up taking advantage of that and going pretty far. So because of that, I'm going to put them in Rogue, probably at the top of Rogue, but I don't really see them on the same tier as a lot of these other decks. Maybe like tier 3, but again, I wouldn't really consider that a top tier strategy or something that can realistically compete. Okay, so again, because we're talking about Sprite, alongside Runick and Naturia or Furhire, I do think that this is one of the variants of Sprite that is actually different enough in the way that it plays, because it's mostly Furhire Runick than it is Furhire Sprite, or Sprite variant. So I am actually going to talk about this one in particular, and I do think that it's pretty decent, just because of the fact that you don't actually need a lot of non-engine, and your just engine pieces in the Runick cards tend to be interactions for whatever your opponent is doing, which is pretty nice. Now, however, with that being said, I don't think it's all that great because it doesn't have the ability to play hand traps, and with the amount of FTKs or pseudo FTKs currently in the format, with things like Infernoble just being able to go through, in FTK with like Exodia or Makonko setting up a nearly unbreakable board with, again, Infernoble, because Infernoble and Isolde are fun cards, and hopefully Isolde does go away eventually. But all things considered, I do think that this deck is still very strong, and it does have a decently good matchup against the rest of the metagame because of those Runick cards. So it's something. It's not exactly great, but I do think that it's pretty good. Moving on, we are going to talk about Sprite. Again, Sprite, I just feel like it is in a pretty decent spot, all things considered. I don't think it's insane by any stretch of the imagination, but being able to play the Adventure engine, being able to play the Tri-Brigade engine, being able to play the Furhire or Runics or what have you, I think that there are so many different options available to Sprite that it feels like at some point you will just have to play Sprite and know what these cards do and know all of these different variants. So I do think that it is something that you are going to have to prepare for, which again leads to such a insanely diverse format. I do think that it's very strong and is definitely something that can compete. Is it the best? No, but is it definitely something to watch out for? Absolutely. Could it win a tournament? For sure. Like, genuinely, I would not be surprised if it ended up winning a tournament. I would be surprised if there were a lot of people playing Sprite all of a sudden, because I do think that it's not the best deck in the room, and it's not the best choice for any particular tournament. But alas. I'm just going to put Runick and everything else for now. I don't really think like Runick Stun or anything like that is of note at the moment, because I feel like there are so many players playing outs to just like generic Runick stuff that it feels like it's not really going to get nearly as far. And since we don't have access to things like Maxi or mostly that, and we are in a higher power format than something like the OCG, I don't see Runick doing nearly as much. Yeah, moving on. I don't know, Flunder's good. I don't know. I feel like Flunder is in a pretty decent spot right now because of the ability to use things like Dimension Shifter. It does allow for a lot of... I'm going to drop this down. I don't think it's that good. It does allow for a lot of like just auto win matchups as well, but you still have to not brick, which I do think matters a lot more in a metagame that is as diverse as it is. You can't afford to lose like a random matchup here or there due to bricking, so I do think that it, as like, especially for a tournament like a YCS, I don't think Flunder is all that great. I do think it's pretty decent, and I wouldn't be surprised if it topped fairly frequently, but I don't expect it to do all that well. I'm actually going to put it below basically everything else here. What is this one called? I genuinely forget. It's the Sark, it's the Horus stuff, but I forget exactly what it does or what it is. Like, you could argue this is like tier stuff, but if we're just talking this individual deck, I'm just going to put it in everything else for now, because again, tier has two different variants, with either not the Horus stuff or with the Horus stuff. That's kind of it. But for now, I don't think Horus is doing really anything without tier, which we'll talk about now, which is really good. Tearlaments has the ability to just kind of lose to itself or absolutely clap you going first. You can either set up an unbreakable board that your opponent doesn't get to interact with and an insane amount of interactions for the follow-up, or you could just not mill the cards that you need to mill and end up losing because of that, you know? It's all just dependent on your mills and what you end up hitting, which is, you know, part of a gamble deck. But even with that being said, I do think that it has a lot of targeted hate as well that really does hurt it. Things like Abyss Dweller, things like Dimensional Shifter, things like I mean, mostly those two. But they're still playable, and there are a lot of decks that can play them as well. Most notably, things like Rescue Ace can main deck the Dimension Shifter, or not main deck, but can side deck the Dimension Shifter to just kind of shut down the Tearlaments strategy. Also, they do have the ability to make an Abyss Dweller if they need to, so there's that. All things considered, though, I still think that this is probably one of the best decks of the format. It also just doesn't really have a bad matchup, I would say. Yeah, most of it is just kind of like losing to itself. I think that it just kind of does its thing and does it consistently. Next up, Infernoble. I want to put this pretty high because there are so many different decks that utilize the Infernoble engine, or more specifically, Isolde, and not actually Infernoble. But even with that being said, I do think that Infernoble has a great shot in the metagame, and it has been topping with like a wild amount of variation. Like the Makonko Infernoble, we've seen Infernoble Exodia, but yeah, just like getting two warriors onto the field gets you so much advantage in the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! That, yeah, you just kind of have to be playing hand traps. So I do think that this like shapes the meta, and I do think that it's also very strong. Infernoble is really, really strong right now. Kashtira is one of the few decks that I genuinely just don't have faith in. Yeah, that's basically it. I think that without a Rise Heart in particular, it doesn't really accomplish anything. Like, yes, you could theoretically play it with, like, Punk if you wanted to, but why do that when you could play Manadimian? You know, why do that when you could play Mathmech or Sprite or something like that that's basically going to end on similar boards of, like, an Omni Negate or two? So yeah, to me it just feels like it's much better off doing something else. That's basically it. I don't really see Kashtira doing all that much, and I don't know who all is experimenting with it, or if anyone actually is, because I just haven't seen any lists or anything like that from Kashtira. So there's that. Labyrinth is in a weird spot. I'm gonna put it in 1.5. I think it's very strong, but I do think that there's a lot of hate for Labyrinth that is available. So if it ever becomes strong, it immediately gets hit by all of that side deck hate. So yeah, I don't know. I don't hate the deck, though. I do think that it is pretty good, all things considered. It's not as good in a format without Max C, because it turns out being able to save your Ash for something like a Big Welcome or what have you does really hurt. So yeah, all things considered, not exceptional, but it's still a very, very strong deck, and can still like Eradicator you or Dimensional Barrier you. Like searching those out specifically is also very nice. So has a lot of things going for it, but it's also not the best. Next up, Manadome. This had a really good performance in the YCS, and I do think that it deserves to go up quite a bit on the tier list. And the reason for this is because it actually did receive quite a few upgrades in the, or not quite a few, but a few upgrades in Agov that allowed it to kind of play around a lot more. But it also, I think, had a good showing because not as many people were main decking things like Droll or Hand Traps or what have you, because honestly the format is still kind of up in the air as to whether or not you want to be playing Hand Traps or Board Breakers. So I really don't know. This could go down quite a bit depending on if people are playing more Hand Traps, and more specifically things like Droll. If you're playing against people who main deck Droll, all of a sudden this deck becomes significantly worse. So it's a toss-up. I'm going to put it pretty high. I do think that the showing at the YCS shows like the actual power level of Manadome, and the fact that it can play through so many different hand traps, as well as quite a few board breakers as well, which is pretty cool. Next up, we have Marincess. I don't doubt that this deck is good. I just don't know how good it is. I really don't see it doing all that much in the current metagame. And I think I'm going to put Salamangreat up here as well. I think Salad's a little bit better, but not all that much. I don't think it's like actually a deck that you need to really worry about. So that's basically it. They're good Cyberse strategies and very strong. I mean, I genuinely have these all tiered out this way. This is basically tier 2 in my eyes. Rogue isn't necessarily not a good deck. It's more so just the decks that aren't realistically going to help you top, right? You're kind of going to be fighting an uphill battle with these ones, whereas all of these ones, you can kind of just coast and potentially get into that top cut. That sounds weird, but there you go. Next up, Mathmech. Mathmech is probably the best of the Cyber strategies, and it's not really confusing to see why. It's just good. I don't really have anything else to say. Even with one circular, it's been putting up results in the OCG, and I really would be surprised if people didn't pick it up in the TCG or haven't already picked it up in the TCG. I still think it's good. I still think it has quite a bit going for it. I'm probably going to put it below Dragon Link, but I mean, it's still Mathmech. You still get the same setups. You still get the same end boards with the same OTKs. So, you know, there's that. And it can play a whole bunch of non-engine, which is very nice, especially in such a diverse format. Playing like hand traps might be worth it. Playing board breakers, whatever it may be. Next up, we have one of the few decks that I believe is in contention for best deck, and that's Purrely. Purrely is just strong in general. Even with one delicious memory, I still think being able to go into a sleepy noir to then set up your big noir, which is very, very nice. On top of that, I think Purrely has the ability to absolutely clap Rescue Ace, which is very important. And on top of that, I don't really think it has a losing matchup against most of these top decks in general. I think a lot of it is like losing to weird matchups like Dragon Link or maybe Sprite. Lots of these things that you're not really expecting to see all that often. Heck, even Labyrinth isn't like the best of matchups. But again, I don't really see these being nearly as common as some of these other top decks, most notably Rescue Ace, which it does have a really, really good matchup against. Next up, Resonator. I think this one's actually pretty decent, but again, I really don't see it doing all that much. The new cards are nice. They're a great boost to the archetype, but are they realistically going to be something that you're going to see in a top cut? Are they things that you are going to see very often in your in like the higher tier events? Probably not. This is definitely like a local legend kind of deck, and sure, it can do work at a local level, but not really too much more. Rika's just good. I don't really have anything else to say. Do I put it below Sprite? Probably not. Rika's just good. I mean, it's just an FTK sometimes, you know, with their end boards off of a single genus loci. Rikka happens to also be a very particular form of interaction that not everyone or any deck is really prepared for, especially since it tributes for costs. So things like the Tearlaments aren't going to trigger, things like your Unchains aren't going to trigger, and a lot of decks can't really interact with that. Like, for example, Omni Negates aren't really going to do a whole lot. So there's that. I do think Rescue Ace has a pretty decent matchup against it, even though, like, if this goes first, it's probably still just going to basically pseudo FTK, but I do think Rescue Ace has a bit of a stronger time against that, which does put it a little bit lower in my eyes. Next up, we have what I would consider the only other tier 1 deck, and that is Unchained. Unchained is just good. The ability to play through so many different forms of interaction from your opponent, because you have, like, the Shavara, you have the Trap, you have the Wave King Caesar, you have, I believe it's that, High Wave King Caesar or something like that. You have all of these options to just, like, continually set up more interactions, and then also the way that it links off monsters to get you a different monster is very particular interaction that not a lot of decks, as I mentioned, are prepared for, and so because of that, I do feel like that it just has the ability to just continually play. And so if hand traps are the way to go, which I do think it's probably the way to go, given the fact that, like, things like Manadome, Infernoble, etc., are all kind of more susceptible to hand traps than there are things like board breakers, then I do think that this deck happens to be a little bit better. That's another reason why I put Purrely so high. I think if board breakers are the way to go, I think Purrely's not nearly as good, but with hand traps, yeah, these two decks don't really care about that. So I'm putting them up there because I think hand traps are the way to go in terms of your non-engine spaces, but who knows? Triple Tech might be the way to play the game, and I might be entirely incorrect. And Tearlament best deck, who knows? And then Vanquish Soul. Turns out not having the bug does hurt this deck quite a bit. However, even with that being said, I still think that this deck is very good. I mean, I don't know. It might just win tournament. Who knows? This is a deck that, honestly, I don't think a lot of people are prepared for. And so because of that, I think that it does have a stronger chance of actually being able to just, like, play through stuff. Yeah, that's basically it. Also, I think this deck becomes a lot better if hand traps become better, which I do think that's probably the way to go. But with things like Droll not necessarily being the best of hand traps for this deck in particular, it means that if Droll in particular becomes good, then this deck's not as helped by that. But again, I still think that the deck is fine. I think it's going to do well. I think it will continue to do well, mostly just because, like, the engine is very strong and very good, specifically in the YCS style events. So all of that considered, I think that it's there. Now, I have no idea with this list. I'm not going to lie. While I do think that this is probably a good assessment of the list, I could be very wrong and could just entirely have no idea. Because, honestly, this is the most up-in-the-air format I think we've had in the TCG in quite some time. Again, Tearlament may just be the best deck. You just gamble and you're good. And Rescue Ace might be, like, the definitive Tier 1 best deck, and nothing can really compete with that. Who knows? Maybe Kashtira actually is still good and people just aren't playing it correctly, and it turns out rank 7s are still very strong to make. But without things like Galaxy Eyes, I really don't... Not Galaxy Eyes. Galaxy Tomahawk, I really don't see that being the case. So, who knows? Again, I don't know. This is just me kind of throwing my hat in the ring, saying, here's this, maybe this is a thing. But that's going to be it for this episode. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, I like us very much, so appreciate it. And if you want to check out more content like this, as well as more Yu-Gi-Oh!, then just be sure to subscribe. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.